The sand didn't whisper that morning, it screamed. Across the desolation of North Africa, where the earth had been baked into submission by a sun that showed no mercy, a new kind of thunder was coming. It wasn't the crack of lightning or the howl of wind through broken stone. It was steel. 500 engines growling in unison, each one dragging 30 tons of American fury across a landscape that had never seen anything like it. The Sherman tank wasn't elegant. It wasn't feared, but on that day in that forsaken corner of the world it became inevitable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. North Africa had become a graveyard long before the tanks arrived. Not of men alone, though there were plenty of those, but of hope. The desert consumed everything: water, courage, sanity. It turned soldiers into ghosts and machines into monuments of rust and failure. For 2 years the British Eighth Army had thrown itself against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps with the desperation of drowning men reaching for driftwood, and for 2 years, Rommel had answered with precision so cold it felt personal. They called him the Desert Fox, and the name was not affection, it was acknowledgment. Rommel didn't fight with numbers, he fought with cunning, with speed, with an instinct for weakness that bordered on supernatural. His Panzer divisions moved like shadows, appearing where they shouldn't, striking before the enemy could breathe. He turned the desert into a chessboard, and every British commander who faced him became a piece swept aside. Tobruk fell, Benghazi fell, men fell, and with each victory, the myth of Rommel grew larger than the man himself. The British soldiers who survived his attack spoke of him in hushed tones, as if saying his name too loudly might summon him from the dunes. "He doesn't sleep," one sergeant muttered after a particularly brutal engagement near Gazala. "He sees through sand." The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Rommel understood something his enemies didn't. In the desert there were no flanks, there was only movement, and whoever moved faster, moved smarter, owned the battlefield. By the summer of 1942 the situation had become critical. The Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire, stood exposed. Cairo trembled. If Rommel broke through at El Alamein, the entire Middle East would collapse like dominoes. Oil fields, trade routes, the very spine of Allied logistics, all of it hung by a thread. Churchill himself paced the halls of Parliament, sleepless, haunted by maps that showed red arrows driving deeper into British-held territory. "We are losing," he told his advisors, not slowly, rapidly, but across the Atlantic. In the factories of Detroit and the assembly lines of Pennsylvania, something was being born, not out of genius, not out of inspiration, but out of necessity. The Americans had watched the war from a distance, measuring, calculating, waiting. When they finally joined, they didn't arrive with elegance, they arrived with volume. The M4 Sherman tank was the embodiment of that philosophy. It wasn't the best tank in the world, it wasn't the fastest, the most armored, or the most powerful, but it could be made. Quickly, endlessly. Where the Germans spent months perfecting a single Tiger tank, the Americans churned out 50 Shermans. Where the British agonized over armor thickness and gun caliber, the Americans simplified, standardized, and shipped. The Sherman was a product of industrial warfare, a machine designed not to win duels but to win wars. Its engine was reliable, its parts were interchangeable, its crew could be trained in weeks instead of months. It was democracy in steel form, imperfect but unstoppable. Captain Daniel Harding stood beside one of those machines on a cold morning in October, watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean. He was 26 years old, too young to have seen the Great War, too old to pretend this one was an adventure. His hands, calloused from weeks of training in the Mojave Desert, rested on the warm hull of his Sherman, a tank he'd named Ironclad. The name felt right, not because it was poetic, but because it was honest. This machine wasn't going to dance around the battlefield. It was going to absorb punishment and keep moving. Harding had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and ambition meant owning a hardware store. He'd enlisted not out of patriotism, though he had that, but out of a simple truth he couldn't escape. The world was burning and sitting still felt like cowardice. His father, a veteran of the First War, had said nothing when Harding announced he was joining. He'd simply handed him a worn compass and said, "Bring it back." Harding kept it in his breast pocket, next to a photograph of a girl named Catherine, who'd kissed him once under an oak tree and told him not to die. The men of his crew were strangers turned brothers by circumstance. Corporal Eddie Vasquez, the gunner, had been a mechanic in Los Angeles before the war. He spoke in short, clipped sentences and never wasted a word. Private Tommy Briggs, the loader, was 19 and lied about his age to enlist. He still wrote letters to his mother every week, letters he sealed but never mailed. Sergeant Leon Monroe, the driver, was the oldest among them at 32. He'd driven trucks across the Rockies for a logging company and claimed he could navigate by the feel of the ground beneath the treads. And then there was Private First Class Ray O'Connell, the assistant driver and bow gunner, a kid from Boston who told jokes no one laughed at but told them anyway because silence felt like surrender. These 5 men, crammed into a metal box barely large enough to stand in, would spend the next weeks living closer than family. They would breathe the same recycled air, smell the same oil and sweat, and rely on each other for survival in ways that made blood seem irrelevant. Harding knew this. He'd seen it in training, the way fear bonded men faster than friendship ever could. But knowing it and living it were different things, and as he climbed into the commander's hatch that morning, he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. The doctrine of the Afrika Korps was built on a single principle: strike before the enemy understands what's happening. Rommel had perfected this philosophy into an art form. His tanks didn't charge blindly into battle. They probed, tested, withdrew, then returned from an unexpected angle with overwhelming force. He used the desert itself as a weapon, luring British columns into kill zones where his 88mm anti-tank guns waited like patient executioners. Those guns, originally designed to shoot down aircraft, had been repurposed into the most feared tank killers on the battlefield. They could punch through British armor at ranges the British couldn't even return fire from. The German Panzer Mark III and Mark IV tanks were nimble, well-armored, and crewed by veterans who'd honed their skills across Europe. They moved in coordinated wedges, supporting each other with interlocking fields of fire. When they advanced, they did so with the confidence of men who knew they were better trained, better equipped, and better led than their opponents. The British had learned this the hard way, watching their Crusader and Matilda tanks brew up, explode into flames, one after another, until entire regiments existed only as smoke trails against the horizon. But the Americans didn't worship the same gods. Their doctrine was simpler, blunter, and born from a different kind of war: overwhelm through numbers, maintain momentum, accept losses but never stop moving. The Sherman tank embodied this philosophy in every rivet. Its 75mm gun wasn't as powerful as the German 88, but it was good enough. Its armor wasn't as thick as a Panzer's, but it was adequate. What made the Sherman dangerous wasn't its individual capability. It was the fact that for every Sherman destroyed, 3 more rolled forward to take its place. The Americans also brought something the British had lacked: logistics. Behind every Sherman came a supply line so efficient it bordered on miraculous. Spare parts, ammunition, fuel, food, all of it flowed across the Atlantic and through the Mediterranean with industrial precision. If a Sherman threw a track, it could be repaired within hours. If its engine failed, a new one could be swapped in by morning. The Germans, starving for resources, watching their supply lines stretch thin across a hostile sea, could only watch in bitter admiration as the Americans turned war into a factory operation. Harding learned all of this in briefings that felt more like lectures than preparation. Maps covered the walls of the command tent, red and blue lines intersecting in patterns that looked like abstract art. Officers pointed at locations with names that meant nothing to him: Kidney Ridge, Mitiria Ridge, Deir el-Sheen. The words sounded foreign, harsh, like the land itself was hostile to language, but one name stood out, repeated over and over until it became a drumbeat in his mind: El Alamein. This was the line. The place where Rommel's advance had stalled, where the British had dug in with the desperation of last stands. For months the two armies had faced each other across minefields and barbed wire, probing, skirmishing, bleeding, neither side strong enough to break the other. But that was about to change. General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed to command the 8th Army, had a plan, and that plan required 500 Sherman tanks had been shipped to Egypt, unloaded at Alexandria, and driven across roads that barely deserved the name. They arrived covered in dust, engines still warm from the journey, crews still adjusting to the heat that turned the inside of a tank into an oven. Harding and his crew spent their first week in North Africa not fighting, but learning. Learning how sand infiltrated every moving part, how mirages could make you see water where there was only stone, how the cold at night could be as brutal as the heat during the day. Monroe, the driver, developed a system. He'd tap the hull every morning before starting the engine, listening for the hollow sound that meant sand had accumulated somewhere it shouldn't. Vasquez, the gunner, obsessively cleaned the breech of the main gun, wiping away dust with a rag he kept tucked in his belt. Briggs, the loader, practiced his movements until he could grab a shell, load it, and step clear in under 4 seconds. O'Connell memorized the sound of the Browning machine gun, learning to hear when it was about to jam before it actually did. And Harding watched them all, learning not just their skills but their rhythms, the unspoken language that crews developed when words became too slow. They trained alongside British units, men who looked at the Shermans with a mixture of hope and skepticism. One British tank commander, a lieutenant with a scar across his jaw, approached Harding after a practice maneuver.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Your tanks are tall," he said, not unkindly. "Makes for a good target." Harding nodded. "So we don't stop moving," he replied. The lieutenant smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll learn," he said. "The desert doesn't care how fast you move, but speed wasn't the point. Endurance was." The Sherman could travel over 100 miles on a single tank of fuel. Its suspension, adapted from farming tractors, absorbed punishment that would have crippled European designs. Its wide tracks distributed weight efficiently, preventing it from sinking into soft sand. And perhaps most importantly, its crew compartment, while cramped, was designed with escape hatches that actually worked. British tanks had a grim reputation for becoming death traps when hit. The Sherman, for all its flaws, gave its crew a chance to survive. That mattered more than armor thickness when every battle felt like a roll of dice. The nights before the offensive were the worst. Harding would lie in his bedroll, staring up at stars so bright they felt accusing, and think about all the ways a man could die in a tank. Fire was the most common. The Sherman's gasoline engine, mounted in the rear, had a tendency to ignite when penetrated. The crews called it brewing up, a dark joke that no one found funny. Harding had seen photographs during training, blackened hulls with hatches blown open, and he tried not to imagine his own crew scrambling for escape while flames licked at their uniforms. But fear was useless. It didn't change anything, so Harding focused on what he could control. He memorized the terrain maps. He studied German tactics. He made sure his crew knew their jobs so well they could perform them blind. And when the orders finally came, when the date was set, and the artillery bombardment scheduled, he felt something strange settle over him. Not courage, exactly. More like resignation. The kind that comes when you realize you've already made the choice and all that's left is to see it through. October 23, 1942, the night before the battle, Montgomery addressed his officers. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing a cricket match rather than an operation that would involve over 1,000 tanks and 100,000 men. "We will break them," he said simply. "Not through brilliance, not through heroics, but through weight. We will press forward, absorb their counterattacks, and grind them down. Some of you will not return, but those who do will have changed the course of this war." Harding stood among the other tank commanders, his hands clasped behind his back, and felt the words settle into his bones. He wasn't afraid of dying, he was afraid of failing, of making a mistake that would get his crew killed, of freezing when action was needed, of being the weak link in a chain that stretched all the way back to Ohio, to his father's compass, to Catherine's kiss under the oak tree. That night, he wrote a letter he didn't intend to send. He wrote about the desert, about the strange beauty of sunsets that turned the sand into gold, about the men he served with, and how they'd become more real to him than anyone back home. He wrote that if he didn't come back, it wasn't because he gave up. It was because some things were worth the risk. He sealed the letter, addressed it to Catherine, and tucked it into his footlocker beneath spare socks and a Bible his mother had insisted he bring. At 21:40 hours, the artillery began. Over 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, a crescendo so loud it didn't sound like noise anymore. It sounded like the earth cracking open. Harding, standing beside Ironclad, felt the concussive waves ripple through his chest. Flashes lit the horizon in staccato bursts, orange and white against the black sky. The bombardment would last for hours, softening German positions, cutting wire, detonating mines, and when it stopped, when the silence returned, more terrible than the noise, the tanks would roll forward. Vasquez climbed into the turret, his face grim. "Here we go," he muttered. Briggs crossed himself quickly, a habit he claimed he'd abandoned. Monroe started the engine, the Ford GAA roaring to life with a cough and then a steady growl. O'Connell checked his machine gun one last time, cycling the bolt, then letting it snap forward. And Harding pulled himself up into the commander's hatch, settling into the seat that would be his home for however long this lasted. The radio crackled. "All units, stand by. Prepare to advance on my mark." Around them, hundreds of other Shermans idled, their engines creating a symphony of mechanical patience. British infantry huddled in trenches, waiting for the signal to follow. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, German positions waited, manned by soldiers who believed they were invincible because Rommel told them they were. But belief is a fragile thing. And steel, when there's enough of it, doesn't need to believe in anything except forward. The moment stretched thin and taut. Harding's hand rested on the rim of the hatch. His heart beat steady, slower than he expected. He thought about the letter in his footlocker. He thought about his crew, silent now, each man alone with whatever prayer or curse kept them sane. He thought about the Desert Fox, somewhere out there calculating, planning, assuming he knew what was coming. But Rommel didn't know about 500 Shermans. He didn't know about American industrial might or the sheer relentless momentum of a nation that had decided it was done watching. He didn't know that the war he'd mastered was about to change into something he couldn't outmaneuver. The radio crackled again, "All units, advance," and the thunder began to move. The first mine detonated at 0200 hours. A British Valentine tank ahead of Harding's column simply disappeared in a flash of orange flame, its turret spinning through the air like a discarded toy. The explosion lit the desert floor, revealing a landscape transformed by artillery into a moonscape of craters and torn earth. Monroe didn't hesitate. He steered ironclad around the burning wreckage, tracks churning through sand that had been turned to glass by the heat. The minefields were supposed to have been cleared by sappers who crawled forward under cover of darkness, probing with bayonets and marking safe lanes with white tape that looked ghostly in the pre-dawn gloom. But mines didn't respect maps, and the tape disappeared under drifting sand. Tanks pressed forward anyway because stopping meant becoming a stationary target, and Harding felt every lurch, every grinding protest from the suspension as ironclad climbed over debris and dropped into shell craters, deep enough to swallow a man. German flares arced overhead, turning night into sickly green day. Machine gun fire chattered from hidden positions, tracers drawing red lines through the darkness. The rounds sparked off ironclad's frontal armor, angry bees that couldn't quite penetrate but promised death if they found a weak point. O'Connell returned fire with the bow gun, short controlled bursts that lit up his face in the cramped forward compartment. Brass casings clinked against the floor, rolling with the motion of the tank. Then came the sound Harding had been dreading. The crack of an 88mm gun, distinct and sharp, cutting through the general chaos like a blade. Somewhere to his left, a Sherman erupted, its ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that turned the hull into a firework. Harding's throat tightened. He keyed the radio. "Contact left," he barked. "Anti-tank position grid 479er, all units suppress." Vasquez was already traversing the turret, the electric motor whining as the main gun swung toward the muzzle flash that had given away the German position. The gunner's voice came through the intercom, calm despite everything. "Identified. Range 800, loading high explosive." Briggs moved with mechanical precision, sliding the shell into the breech, tapping Vasquez's shoulder to signal ready. "Fire," Harding ordered. The 75mm gun roared. The entire tank rocked backward from the recoil, and for a moment Harding lost his night vision in the flash. When it returned, he saw the 88 position silenced, its crew scattered or dead, the gun itself canted at an unnatural angle. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Sherman behind them took a hit, its engine deck erupting in flames. Men bailed out, rolling in the sand to extinguish their burning uniforms. This was the crucible Rommel had prepared. His defensive positions were layered, interlocking, designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones where every advantage belonged to the defender. German infantry crouched in slit trenches with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, waiting for the moment when a Sherman's thin side armor would present itself. Panzer tanks, dug in hull down with only their turrets exposed, formed strong points that required direct hits to neutralize. And everywhere, mines waited with infinite patience. But Montgomery's plan didn't rely on finesse, it relied on mass. For every Sherman destroyed, two more pushed forward. The British infantry followed in the wake of the armor, clearing trenches with grenades and bayonets, consolidating ground that the tanks had opened. Artillery continued to fall on German positions, adjusted by forward observers, who called in coordinates even as machine gun fire kicked up sand around their foxholes. The battle became a grinding, relentless pressure that gave Rommel no room to maneuver. Harding lost track of time. Dawn came without him noticing, the sky lightening from black to gray to a pale blue that seemed obscene in its normalcy. Ironclad's interior reeked of cordite, sweat and hot metal. Monroe's face was streaked with oil, his hands locked on the control levers with white-knuckled determination. Vasquez fired, reloaded, fired again, his movements automatic, muscle memory overriding thought. Briggs stopped counting shells after the 20th. O'Connell's machine gun barrel glowed red, despite periodic barrel changes. They encountered their first Panzer Mark IV at 0630 hours. It appeared from behind a low ridge, its long-barreled 75mm gun already tracking toward them. Harding saw at the same instant Vasquez did. Target front, the gunner snapped. Harding barely had time to register the shape before Vasquez fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Panzer's turret face and ricocheted upward, failing to penetrate. The German tank fired back. The world became noise and light. The German shell hit Ironclad's frontal glacis plate at an angle, deflecting upward and taking the radio antenna with it. The impact rang through the tank like a bell, stunning every man inside. Harding's vision doubled then cleared. He tasted copper, his ears screamed with tinnitus, but the tank was still moving, Monroe still driving, Vasquez already adjusting aim for a second shot. Flank him, Harding ordered, his voice sounding distant in his own head. Monroe threw Ironclad into a hard turn, tracks digging into the sand, presenting their side armor for a dangerous moment but gaining a better angle on the Panzer. Vasquez didn't wait for the command. He fired the instant the German tank's side appeared in his sight. This time the shell punched through, and the Panzer shuddered, smoke billowing from its hatches. No one emerged. The battle dissolved into a series of moments stitched together by adrenaline and fear. Harding saw a Sherman charge an anti-tank position head-on, absorbing 3 hits before crushing the gun under its tracks. He saw British infantry swarm a German machine gun nest, their fixed bayonets glinting. He saw a Panzer Mark III brew up after taking a hit from a British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, its crew abandoning the vehicle with their uniforms smoldering. He saw men die, some quickly, some slowly, and he forced himself to look away because dwelling on it meant losing focus. By mid-morning, Rommel's first defensive line had fractured. The Germans fell back to secondary positions, fighting delaying actions that bought time but couldn't stop the momentum. Harding's radio, miraculously still functional despite losing its antenna, crackled with reports. Breakthrough at Kidney Ridge. Infantry consolidated at Mitiria, armor advancing on Tel El Aquaker. The names meant nothing but the tone did. They were winning, but winning came with a cost written in burning metal. Harding passed the wrecks of dozens of Shermans, some still smoking, others already cold and abandoned. He passed British tanks too, Crusaders and Grants, their crews dead inside or sheltering in whatever cover they could find. The desert floor was littered with the debris of war, track links, shell casings, discarded helmets, bodies covered with ponchos. Medics worked frantically, triaging wounded under fire, their Red Cross armbands offering no real protection. Ironclad took another hit at 1100 hours, this time from a concealed anti-tank gun that had let the lead elements pass before opening fire on the following tanks. The shell struck the turret side, penetrating just below the gun mantled. Vasquez screamed. Harding felt something hot spray across his face and realized it was blood. The gunner slumped forward, his left arm hanging useless, shrapnel embedded in his shoulder and neck. Briggs moved without thinking, pulling Vasquez from the gunner's seat and pressing a field dressing against the worst of the wounds. Harding dropped into the turret taking Vasquez's position, his hands finding the controls through training that overrode panic. He traversed the turret, spotted the anti-tank gun's position by its muzzle flash, and fired. The high-explosive shell landed short. He adjusted, fired. A gun position disappeared. In a cloud of sand and smoke, Vasquez was still breathing, his eyes unfocused but alive. "We need to fall back," Briggs said, his voice cracking. "Get him to a medic." Harding shook his head. "We stop, we die." He keyed the radio. "This is Ironclad. Casualty aboard. Continuing advance. Request medical support at Rally Point Delta." The reply came back cold and professional. "Acknowledged. Proceed to objective." O'Connell kept firing. Briggs took over as loader while also trying to keep pressure on Vasquez's wounds, and Harding became gunner and commander both, his world narrowing to the gun sight and the endless stretch of desert ahead. His hands were steady, his voice was calm when he gave orders, but inside, in a place he couldn't acknowledge, something was screaming. The German counterattack came at 1400 hours. Rommel, sensing the danger, had committed his mobile reserves, a Kampfgruppe built around 15 Panzer Mark IVs and a company of mechanized infantry. They swept in from the south, trying to hit the Allied advance in the flank, to disrupt the momentum before it became unstoppable. It should have worked. Against the British alone, it might have. But the Shermans didn't fight like the British. Harding's company, reduced to 9 operational tanks, turned to meet the threat. No elegant maneuvers, no clever tactics, just a wall of steel moving forward, guns firing as fast as loaders could feed them. The Germans had skill and experience, the Americans had numbers and desperation. 2 Shermans died in the first exchange, catastrophic kills that left no survivors, but 3 Panzers died with them, and the math was brutal. The Germans couldn't afford to trade 1 for 1, the Americans could trade 3 for 1 and still win. The counterattack broke against American persistence like a wave against stone. The Panzers withdrew, fighting a running battle trying to preserve their dwindling strength. Rommel's voice, intercepted by Allied signals intelligence, crackled across German radio nets with uncharacteristic strain. Fall back to Fuka, preserve the force. It was the beginning of the end, though no one knew it yet in the chaos of the moment. By evening, as the sun set and turned the desert into blood and gold, the offensive had achieved its objectives. Rommel's Afrika Corps, undefeated for 2 years, was in retreat. The British 8th Army and their American allies had broken through at El Alamein, opening a gap that couldn't be closed. Over the following days, the retreat would become a rout, German and Italian forces abandoning equipment, surrendering in thousands, fleeing west toward Tunisia with Allied armor pursuing. Harding finally got Vasquez to a field hospital at 1900 hours. The gunner was unconscious but stable, his chances good if infection didn't set in. A British surgeon, his apron stained dark, glanced at Harding and said, "Your man will live." Then he turned back to the operating table, where someone else was dying. Harding stood there for a moment, numb, then walked back to Irons. The tank looked like it had aged decades in a single day. The hull was scarred with impact marks, the turret dented, one track hanging loose from damage that Monroe was already repairing. O'Connell sat on the rear deck, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Briggs was asleep in the commander's hatch, too exhausted to move. Monroe looked up from his work, and met Harding's eyes. "We made it," the driver said quietly. Harding nodded but didn't speak. Around them, the battlefield was settling into uneasy quiet. Fires still burned, wounded still cried out, but the shooting had stopped, at least for now. Tomorrow they would advance again, chase the retreating enemy, fight more battles. But tonight, in this stolen moment of peace, Harding allowed himself to feel what he'd been suppressing all day. They had won, not gloriously, not cleanly, but decisively. The myth of Rommel's invincibility had shattered against American steel and British resolve. The Desert Fox was running, his carefully constructed defensive positions overrun, his best troops dead or captured, his plans unraveling faster than he could adapt. The tide had turned, not through brilliance, but through the simple brutal arithmetic of industrial war. Harding pulled the compass from his pocket, the one his father had given him. The glass was cracked from the impact that had hit Ironclad's turret, but it still pointed north. He thought about the letter in his footlocker, the one addressed to Catherine. He wouldn't send it now. There would be other battles, other days when death felt close enough to touch, but tonight, he had survived. His crew had survived, and that was enough. The Sherman tank would go on to fight across North Africa, through Sicily, into Italy, across the beaches of Normandy. It would be outmatched by German Tigers and Panthers, yet it would prevail through the same logic that won at El Alamein. Quantity became quality when applied with enough determination. The factory could always build more Shermans than the enemy could kill, but in that moment, sitting on Ironclad's battered hull under a sky full of stars, Harding didn't think about history or strategy. He thought about Vasquez, alive because they'd kept moving. He thought about Monroe's steady hands, O'Connell's grim humor, Briggs' faith. He thought about the wrecks they'd passed, the men who wouldn't write letters home, whose families would receive telegrams instead of explanations. Victory tasted like sand and smoke. It felt like exhaustion too deep for sleep. It sounded like the wind moving through destroyed machines. Harding had expected triumph to feel different, somehow cleaner. Instead it just felt like survival with a margin so thin you could see through it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.